If I started stopping people in the street right now and surveying them and asking them the question, what causes depression, 80% of them would say a chemical imbalance of some kind. That's 4 out of 5 people would say a chemical imbalance. And a lot of those would actually say specifically it's a lack of serotonin in the brain. So why do 80% of people think that when the science suggests otherwise? Let's do a bit of a history lesson on where this chemical imbalance theory comes from and why it's so largely accepted in society today. So in 1987, Prozac was released. Prozac's like the granddaddy of all antidepressants. It started a whole line of other antidepressants which are categorized in a category called SSRIs, which stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. After these were released and people started using them, they were being prescribed, a lot of doctors and psychiatrists were asked, how did depression work and how did these help with depression? And a lot of them would say at the time, like, I don't know. We don't know really how they work or what causes depression. So they started looking then to explain this at the mechanism of action of the drug. Because if we work out the mechanism of action, we can start to say, hey, the reverse of that must be the cause of depression. That's really, really bad science, but that's what they did. So the way these drugs work, I want you to imagine now in your brain, we have all these neurons, these brain cells. We have what's called a presynaptic neuron, a postsynaptic neuron, and in the middle is what's called the synapse. It's basically the gap between the two. When our brain sends some sort of signal, so we'll use the example of serotonin here, the presynaptic neuron releases a serotonin molecule into the synapse. The postsynaptic neuron then has on it what's called receptors. So these are specifically serotonin receptors. The serotonin molecule fits into the receptor like a little cup, perfectly, fits in like that. So it docks on the postsynaptic neuron. Once that signal is sent, the serotonin then comes back into the synapse, that gap between cells. It is then reuptaken and recycled by the presynaptic neuron. It's a nice circling effect and it is recycled and it goes back. Now, that's how a healthy brain works and how these chemicals start interchanging between neurons. Now, how the SSRI drugs work is they, like in the name, they inhibit the reuptake of serotonin. So imagine that process I just explained. The serotonin molecule comes out of the presynaptic cell into the synapse. It docks in the serotonin receptor. However, then when it goes back into the synapse to be reuptaken by the presynaptic neuron, the drug blocks that reuptake process. So it can't get taken back into the original cell and more free serotonin is floating in that synapse in between cells. It means the more serotonin that we have, more free serotonin floating around in our brain. So because that's the mechanism of action of the drug, it was therefore assumed, it was therefore hypothesized that depression was caused by a lack of serotonin. Okay, this was really great for marketing this because to think an issue as complex as depression, an issue as complex as a mental illness can be solved by a simple little adjustment in brain chemistry and a simple pill. I wish it was true. I really wish it was true, but it just sounded so good. And now these big drug companies were able to market that to the public, to doctors, to psychiatrists. They're able to put that out there, and this is why it's generally taken as the truth. Now, like I said at the start, looking at a mechanism of action and then referring and assuming a cause isn't very, very good science. So what they did, they said, hey, we need to find out how much serotonin is going on in the brains of people who are depressed. Now, there is no test available. We don't have the technology yet to measure live neurotransmitter activity in the brain of a live human being. We can't do it. We can't sit someone down who's alive and measure the amount of serotonin or dopamine or norepinephrine or acetylcholine going through their brain. What you can do is measure this on people who have recently passed away, people who have died. So they started doing this. They would do autopsies on people who had suffered from depression who had passed away. What they noticed was on the neurons, those serotonin receptors that I was talking about, there was far less of them in these patients. This confirmed the hypothesis. Okay, people who suffer from depression have less serotonin receptors, which mean less serotonin going through the brain, which is causing their depression. They were almost there at confirming it, but not quite. Because all the people they autopsied, yes, they had suffered from depression, but they had also been medicated on SSRI medication. So to finally confirm this hypothesis, they had to do these tests on people who had passed away, who had suffered from depression, but who hadn't ever been medicated. So they started doing that. When they were examining the brains of people who had suffered from depression but hadn't been medicated, what they found was they had the identical amount of serotonin receptors as a normal, healthy human being. There was no lack of them. Bummer. The hypothesis was starting to get a little bit shaky. So what was going on here? Our brain, our body we are adaptive creatures. Our brain's amazing. It's so plastic. It can move throughout our lifetime and adjust where need to. Our brain's always going to try and keep some sort of homeostatic level to try and keep us at a level without getting to the extremes. What happens when you block the reuptake of serotonin and there's too much serotonin floating in the synapse in between cells, our brain, being as smart as it is, says, hey, we have too much serotonin going on here. I need to stop producing that. One way to stop producing that is to then clip off serotonin receptors off the postsynaptic nerve. That's how incredible our brain is. I have too much serotonin, let me get rid of some of these receptors because I don't need it as much. What this meant was the hypothesis that depression was a lack of serotonin and SSRI medication rectified that. The exact problem that it was claiming to rectify, it was causing that problem. People who were using SSRI medications for a period of time ended up having far lower serotonin because the brain was adapting to this unnatural state. This put a dagger through the chemical imbalance hypothesis. It was very, very shocking for a lot of people. A lot of the psychiatric industry came out then and just admitted, they said, yeah, this science shows that these things, there's no such thing as a chemical imbalance. In 2011, Ronald Pies, doctor, very, very highly regarded psychiatrist, came out and said no serious psychiatrist seriously propounded the chemical imbalance theory because it was never proven to be correct. So him coming out and saying that was going to be the final nail through the coffin of this chemical imbalance theory, yet that was in 2011. 8 years later, 4 out of 5 people on the street still think depression is caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain. Now, what's the point of this video? The point is, I'm not here just to shit on medication, because the truth is medication can save lives in the short term. If someone has an acute situation where someone might be going through a patch and they're feeling suicidal, someone mightn't be able to get out of bed, not to just not work, but maybe not even to be able to get the help that they need to get. Medication can get people out of a bind in these acute situations and allow them to do the actual work of analysing their life and their past, which can then help alleviate the symptoms of depression. What I'm trying to get at is, medication is never the answer. Medication is never going to cure depression. No one wants to be on medication for 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, because like I said, it shows that then we will have a lower amount of serotonin than whenever we started the medication. So I'm saying medication should be used in acute situations, and I'm not a doctor. I'm not saying you should stop your medication. Please don't if you're on it, because the thing is, the reason why it's then we have to slowly wean off a medication like that is because our brain has to then start to go back to normal and start produce the amount of serotonin we need. That's why it's very, very important to taper off medications like this under the supervision of a GP or a psychiatrist, so we can slowly get the brain to start producing the serotonin it needs again. That's why when we stop cold turkey these medications, the withdrawals are horrific and people can get suicidal and in all sorts of horrible states by coming off them quickly. So I'm not saying stop your medication or that medication isn't useful. I'm just saying it's not the answer. It can help us through a period of time get the help that we really need, and that's addressing our life, addressing our trauma, addressing our past, addressing the situations that are showing up that we may be living incongruently with, so we can start to alleviate that depression for good.